Hi, everybody. I really want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for all the work you're doing on the archive. This has been quite a journey from 1979, and we thought we might give you some background about the material, the interviews, and how this all got started. Um, Professor Nora Levin was the the history professor at Gratz at that time, and I was her student a long time ago. Hair a different color, and I was studying with her, and there was a lecture that was going on in town where Dory Laub, who's a professor, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, professor at Yale, was showing some audio and video interviews with survivors that they were using in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale. And we attended this lecture. And during the interview, Nora turned to me and she said, "Do you want to do this?" And I said, "Sure." That was 1979. I was a clinical social worker at that time. And that background was what Nora was interested in. She was the historian. I was coming with an interviewing background. How did we get interviews? What was our thinking? At that time, oral histories were not terrifically respected by historians. They saw them as slanted, they did not see them as accurate. Our idea was that they were crucial to understanding the actual personal experience. And we, without any kind of funding, without any backing, holed up in an area of Gratz College in one of the older buildings. We decided to try to find survivors who were willing to talk with us on audio tape. Nora had very strong feelings about not doing video because she wanted the survivors to have a degree of privacy in terms of their emotional response. So we stayed with audio and we visited survivors in their homes. The way we got to many of the survivors was interesting. There was a librarian on our staff at that time who was the daughter of survivors who gave us her wedding list, since most of the people at that wedding were other survivors in addition to her parents. We started with them, and it was always, "Are you willing to?" Nobody was ever required. This was very voluntary. We went into personal homes, and that made all the difference. We were interviewing around kitchen tables. And it was done in a very personal way, so that with some of the material you might be seeing, there's a very intimate quality to it. There were no video cameras. There was nobody else in the room. It was a conversation between two people. Some of the interviews that you might see were done in a different way. They were done in 1985 at the International Gathering, or the American Gathering for Holocaust Survivors, here in Philadelphia. And those were done at the Civic Center in the middle of, shall we say, circus conditions, with just cloth in between the interviewers so that there's a lot of background noise. Though it's very personal, you have the chaos of what else was going on in that very important place. But we were able to get several hundred interviews that way. And they were shorter because we basically were interviewing people for an hour. The other interviews were running 4 and 5 hours up to, I believe, 12 hours. And I'm going to let Vi talk about one of the ones that you,
Which one?
the 12-hour one.
Okay. Yes. Now, I never interviewed anyone. I didn't come on until 1995 or something, when I retired and heard Josey in a presentation about the archive and went up and said, "Do you need any volunteers?" At that time, we weren't really interviewing that much anymore. Some people were. Um, the longest tape that, so what I did is listen to tapes and correct the transcript, which usually it's not very accurate. What we do is check all of the name places, check for historical accuracy, um, and of course, the person who was typing, there's a lot of Yiddish words, Polish words. Not that I know all those words, but they just typed what they heard. They didn't bother to look it up. They were just typing from what they hear. So it took me 2 years to complete the transcript of Henry's score, which was on seven, I think, seven different tapes. Um, and to say, that was an experience because Mr. Score told you everything that he was going on, in, not only in his life, but in the life of the history of Poland and Russia, going all the way back. At the time, we had a librarian at Gratz who was from Russia and knew many languages, and he was very helpful to me in translating the foreign words. Um, and that's one. The other thing that I'm very proud of working on is our collection of liberator or witnesses to the liberation, as we call it. We have a whole collection of GIs who were there at the liberation, or who we have a couple of people who were in prisoner of war camps, um, who are also certainly survivors. I think all the GIs are survivors as well.
In line with this, and we were able to hear sort of the end of your discussion about the article. We did have people on our staff, all of whom were volunteers, who had had the experience themselves of what they were interviewing people about. So it gave them a different kind of soul, a different kind of information. And the witnesses to the liberation were largely interviewed by Phil Solomon, who himself was present at the liberation of Ordruff. We knew Phil's story. He, we have his interview. One of our other staff interviewed him. We also had, for a long period of time, an average of about 24 volunteers every week, and a half of those volunteers were people who had experienced the war years in one way or another. We had somebody who was on the Kindertransport. We had people who were in camps. We had people who were in hiding. We had
People who were on the St. Louis as children.
two different people who had very different experiences. So the uniqueness of each experience was something that was terribly important to us. That one of the things that we see as we're looking through these interviews is the fact that people are speaking from their hearts, from their memories, from their sense memories, from their long-term memory. So the interviews themselves give us more than just historical accounts. They're oral histories in the way that we've been able to experience them. have given us more information in different logical, as well as the individual experience. And to be able to interview multiple people who had the same experience and not necessarily have the same story come from them is one of the things that we treasure in what we're doing.
We also try to, in the interviews, to ask them about life before the war and try to bring that into it as well to show who these people were before the experience that they went through.
On a couple of occasions, we actually were able to interview the same person twice over a period of time. Not many, but very interesting differences. When one interview was done 10 years later, we also interviewed people very much wanted to interview people by themselves, not with their spouse there. And there was an occasion where I interviewed someone who insisted that his spouse be present. She wanted to be present, and he gave me his account. At another time, another one of our interviewers was able to interview him again, and the spouse was not there. There were definite discrepancies between the two interviews, and which we also found fascinating. So the idea of contrast between interviews, the idea of when the interview is done, and the mood that the interviewee is in at the time. One woman that I interviewed was sobbing when I arrived at her door because her son had just been attacked on a Philadelphia bus. And it was very difficult for her to talk. She had written something out and she read it. And in reading her statement, she calmed down and then was able to be interviewed for several hours after that. So how that interview would have gone on a different day, it's hard to know. So the uniqueness of each can depend on time and mood. There was also a woman that I interviewed who was on leave from a psychiatric facility. And we had interviewed her ex-husband. She appeared at the door in a very colorful Japanese kimono. She had the lipstick sign, which is not uncommon for schizophrenic people. She was very warm, very open, very detailed, had had a horrific early childhood. This is where the pre-war information mattered tremendously. Her mother had died when she was quite young. There were a number of other children in the family. The father was desperate. He tried to pawn her off on various relatives. By the time she was in the camp, she had lived with countless other people. And at some point during the interview, she turned to me and she said, "If you think I'm crazy because of Auschwitz, you're crazy." And she was right. Her early experience had set her up for this. We know from other interviews with other people who went through incredible concentration camp and death camp experiences that they came out of it in a different way just because of their individual makeup. So the individuality of these interviews is I think one of the precious parts of it. And as you are able to look at different interviews, you will see the different personalities and how the history is not one history. It's multiple histories.
Yeah. In my experience of working with the transcripts and learning of, the testimonies, you'll find that in each testimony of a person who survived, there was some moment, some person who helped them, some kindness, because otherwise I don't think they would have survived without that.
We'd like to know what your questions are so we can tell you more.
My questions have gone out of my head because I'm still stuck on the point that you said a lot of the interviewers were actually survivors and liberators as well, and my mind is blown by that fact. That's so incredible. Um, do you think that because of that personal connection that opened up a way of storytelling that maybe would have not been with just like a professional historian or someone who had done tons of interviews up to that point? I guess I'm just so like mind blown by that. That's incredible.
I think without question, there were certain survivors, survivor staff, who were able to connect with people in a different way. For instance, we had a wonderful woman, Edith Millman from Poland, who was able, first of all, to interview in Polish and translate the interview for us. We also had Hannah Silver, who, a German survivor. She was in Berlin throughout the war, not in hiding, who was able to interview in German. Again, I think a more natural flow for some of the interviewees, and then translate it for us. I also think that the lay nature of our project made people more comfortable. I do think that it mattered that they weren't being videoed, that we were sitting at kitchen tables. I don't know, quite frankly, if among all the people that I interviewed, if I was ever not offered food, coffee, tea. I had one gentleman who baked a cake, a coffee cake, another one from France who said we will have luncheon after the interview, had set a proper table with silver and crystal, and we had wine. And it was very important for them to feed me. It was another woman who had been in Hungary and desperately trying to scrounge for food for her own family, said, "I'm sorry, all I have to offer you is Entenmann's because I don't cook anymore." And she opened her cupboards and they were basically empty. So I think that mattered. We did not use formal language. We were with them in the interview as much as possible. I'm talking about our regular staff. Again, I think that there, without question, some of the interviews that we have from the gathering are just as high quality. It depended on who was doing it. We actually did have a day of so-called training for those people, which was a little crazy. We had several hundred people come to one of our local synagogues, and Nora gave a historical background. I gave a how to interview background. And there's some really good material in there. We were initially not going to transcribe those. Where we are now with AI and such incredible help as you're giving us was never something that we ever thought would happen. We just kept moving. Nora died in 1989, and I sort of by default ended up as director. I had been working all those years with it, and it just, I was determined not to stop, and that's where we are now, all these years later. We're packing up to move a couple of times within the next 2 years, which is going to be somewhat humorous. But somehow the staff is still here. We're here on a different day this week. It's usually Tuesday. And in a similar way, one of the things that I've done is I've determined that Tuesday is the day that all the volunteers come. And Tuesday at 12:30, we all eat together. And we are friends, and we are colleagues and friends. And the relationships among the staff, I think, matter as well. Because some of this material is hard, and nobody is by themselves doing it. We're all together, and they're for each other. We're there when somebody needs a Yiddish word heard by somebody who is unfamiliar, or it's a different kind of Yiddish from a different part of Europe. We're there for each other when things come up in the interviews that we want to talk about. And we have people who know what it's like to do the work. So I think that matters.
How the archive has changed with the advent of new technologies and how the goals of the archive or the uses of the testimonies have changed over time, especially when, as you said, in the 70s, oral testimony wasn't given much weight. But I think most of us can agree today in the last 20, 30 years, it's become a cornerstone of learning about the Holocaust. So what has that transition been like with the weight that we put on testimony and how it's being able to be recorded and shared, etc.?
Well, one thing I would say is that, of course, we used audio tapes, and that was our only technology. And we were poor. That ended up helping us because as technology changed, we did not change our technology because we didn't have the money to go into, say, a CD or another form. And when in the long run, we had the gift of both Yad Vashem having a copy of our material and the USHMM, whose technique was more advanced than Yad Vashem's, to be able, and that's the sound that is now part of the Gratz collection. They said to us, it's better because you didn't change it, that you used the original masters in order to go directly into the more advanced form. So being poor, not having funding for that, though we tried very hard to get funding, got none. Again, because I have some fabulous letters of people who just didn't see what we were doing as having any value, including the National Endowment for the Humanities. They saw absolutely no value in the collection. But the USHMM did, and we were one of the first collections that they went to when they opened. Remember, we had started in 79 and they weren't in business until the 90s.
We were probably the second after Yale in the country. And I have to say, it's due to this woman here who is very persistent and kept going all through the years. We have, of course, our old staff. When I started, it was such an experience to have all of these survivors from so many different experiences. I don't think we had two survivors with the same experience. One was in Norway, one was here. One was interned on the Isle of Man. It was just unbelievable, the variation of experiences that they had. And that, of course, led to a lot of good conversation. But now we have some younger, I'm the old person, we have some younger people who are children of survivors who have recently joined our staff. So that's very rewarding as well. But people say to me, oh my God, you've been doing this for so many years. It's so depressing. Why do you do that? And I say, it's not depressing. I come and see wonderful people and we have good conversations and it's meaningful. And it's like a highlight of my week. So
I was wondering if I could ask, did you present the offer to interview? Did you call them survivors at that time? Did they identify as being survivors? Because I know that like my grandparents never wanted to record their testimony because they didn't go to the camp, so they didn't count. For them, it's like we went through the war, we're not survivors. So I'm wondering if that played a role in people's willingness to share, or if you used a different approach at that time because it wasn't the term that was being used.
Yeah, I think you're right. There were, we couldn't interview everyone, from that standpoint, that there were people who did not think their experiences counted. All right. I didn't suffer enough. We heard that. But we also, in a different way, there was a gentleman that I had made a date with and went to his store. Some of these interviews were done in very curious ways. I went to his store before it opened and he let me in, and I was going to stand in front of his glass case, his glass display case, and the lights were very low. There was only a light in the back of the store because he didn't want anybody to think he was open. We started to talk, and from upstairs, his wife started screaming, "Don't tell her anything." And she was screeching. And he continued to talk, and I interviewed him for about 3 hours standing there. And on the tape, you can hear his wife screaming. She did not want the information out. She did not, certainly would not be interviewed. But she also didn't want him to tell his story. I couldn't find out why, except that we didn't give up, and his account was extremely a very important one to have. So there were different reasons, all of which we respected. It was not our goal to make people upset. Our goal was to give them an opportunity to have their material on record. And originally, some of the people in the early 80s were glad to have us interview because we gave copies of the interview on audio tape to all of them. And there was a gathering in Jerusalem, and a lot of them took the copy to Jerusalem. So Israel has gotten multiple copies. I think it's harder to access.
Yeah.
Vi has.
they don't have them online as the US HMM does. I think you have to be in their library to access it, which I've done, but
All of those interviews are here, the ones that went there. But that was a good motivation. And then our interviewing in 85 at the gathering here was, of course, another big collection.
yeah, I have to say that a lot of the survivors and the liberators, the GIs as well, this was the first time that they spoke about their experience.
Yeah.
And their families didn't even know about it. The GIs, a lot of their families didn't even know that they had liberated camps, so they had been in the camps because they completely shut down. They did not want to talk about it.
One of the liberator, Phil Solomon, who basically was the head of our Witness to the Liberation project, would scream out at night. His son told us when we later did a major project with those interviews that it was never discussed, that his wife, who would bring him here every week to work, did not know about his experience until he was interviewed by us. The son did not know. The other, just another interviewing moment that made, I think, that was very unusual was there were two reunions in Philadelphia of people who had gone to Shanghai. They were called rickshaw reunions. People from all over the world. They were in a hotel downtown, and we set up a desk and we interviewed people in their bedrooms, sitting on beds, sitting on the floor, however, whatever was needed to set us up with our tape recorders. We have 2 different reunions that were the opportunity to do this. And from what we know from the president of this group, we might have the largest number of interviews with people who went to Shanghai that was ever done, because there was such a specific time. Nothing stopped us.
In thinking more about survivors and liberators interviewing, how did you did you encounter where this was maybe even re-traumatizing to them in the interview process, as they're hearing someone else's story, but then did it impact any of these interviewers in ways that maybe weren't anticipated because they're hearing someone else's trauma and it's triggering them?
It's a great question. I don't know that anyone reported that, okay, or talked about it with the group. Without question, some of these interviews were just hard. They were really hard. And that's where our lunchtime mattered. There was a great deal of discussion. And I think hopefully the support from the staff helped those staff members who had had personal experiences as well. Whether what happened at night, whether they, their dreams were stimulated, I don't remember hearing. What I do think is that I think they ended up resolving some of their experience by helping others learn more about this time. There was a positive for them. All of them were interviewed. There was nobody on our staff who was not interviewed who were staff members themselves. But I think the process for them was another way of working through perhaps that they were not the only ones.